Welcome to the live audience and the online audience. Welcome to the 370th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture-story Symposium. This is a weekly lecture series about comics, animation, and other text image work. The series is sponsored in part by the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation. And our guest tonight is Bill Griffith. He's the creator of the syndicated daily Zippy and the author of Nobody's Fool, The Life and Times of Schlitzie the Pinhead, and Invisible Ink, My Mother's Secret Love Affair with a Famous Cartoonist, among many other small projects. His strips have appeared in the Village Voice, National Lampoon, and the New Yorker. And he is, in Bartlett's familiar quotations, he's credited with having coined the popular phrase, "Are we having fun yet?" He returns tonight to the Comic Symposium to talk about his new book, Three Rocks, the story of Ernie Bushmiller, the man who created Nancy. So please welcome Bill Griffith.
Yeah, Ben's gonna turn the lights on a little bit. Get some movie atmosphere going here. Okay, so why is my book called Three Rocks? Ernie Bushmiller creates a little landscape, a place in which his characters live. It's beautifully constructed. It's repetitive. It has iconic elements like Nancy and Sluggo are walking down the sidewalk, and behind them is a perfectly manicured lawn, one tree, a horizon line, one building on the horizon line, and between the sidewalk and the horizon line, three rocks. Not one rock, not two rocks, although he did occasionally do one and two rocks. But three to me is, there's something about three, the Trinity, the Holy Trinity of three. So to me, it kind of speaks of the essence of the strip, the perfectly hemispheric, perfectly artificial rocks. No rocks are completely smooth like that, only in Bushmiller land do they look that way. So here's the cover. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book. It's been out for about a month. It's actually doing better than any book I've ever done. So I have to thank Sluggo, because I think I'm flying on Sluggo's coattails. Nancy doesn't have coattails. If she did, I would give her credit, but Sluggo has coattails. Which brings me to another point. Not only is Bushmiller's landscape, the place in which he populates his characters, iconic and simple, but his characters are stuck permanently in a certain decade. The outfit that Sluggo wears, to me, kind of speaks of a Depression era. What little boy wears a black sport jacket? If you look at pictures of workers in the 1930s, whether they were on strike or working, the men, if they're wearing jackets, were wearing sport jackets. There was no, you couldn't go to a store and have 300 kinds of jackets. There was just one jacket. And if you were a worker and you wanted to wear something that kind of a little bit warm but not really heavy, that's what you wore. And of course that hat.
I hate to interrupt you. Could you speak just a little? They're just asking you in there if you could speak just a little closer to the mic. I'm very sorry to interrupt.
Okay. So Nancy and Sluggo look permanently stuck in either the 1930s or the 1940s, which has a charm also. They don't change. They don't grow. They don't tell you what it's like to be a child. What Nancy comics tell you is what it's like to be a comic strip. Nancy strips in their, the way they depict the characters, the way the humor works, is pure comics. There's no intent on the part of Ernie Bushmiller to make you like the characters or to think he's captured the essence of childhood, which Charles Schultz was trying to do. He just wanted to make you laugh. That's all he wanted. But in doing so, he created one of the most surreal, bizarre comic strips to ever appear in daily newspapers. I had to put this in the book because I wanted to make it very clear to people that read the book that anytime you see Nancy or any of the other characters from the strip, even if they're inside some drawings that I've created, I never redrew any of them. I collaged them in. I'm totally old school, so I cut them out and pasted them into a piece of paper. I did not redraw any of the characters. This is the first thing I saw, aside from Nancy's strips. This is from a book called Comics and Their Creators, which came out in the 1940s. And for many years, it was the only book in which you could read biographies of cartoonists, of daily strip cartoonists. So this is the drawing that Ernie Bushmiller did for that book. And I just think it's just a great, just a beautiful little portrait of both him and his characters. And we'll get a little bit into things like why is there a pinup girl in the Nancy world? We'll talk about that eventually. So this is a page I did at a certain point in the book in which I thought I would find a way to make an entertaining presentation of something that Ernie Bushmiller wrote about what it's like to be a cartoonist, that kind of advice for young cartoonists. So in panel number 2 at the top, where you see the quote, where it says some cartoonists, some comic artists, all the way till the end, that's all Ernie giving advice to cartoonists of the day. I like the one at the end, number 6. That's about all. It's a swell profession, and you only have to work 70 hours a week. Right, to this day, no daily strip cartoonist has any vacation time. We're supposed to produce comic strips 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and somehow not have a nervous breakdown. What we do is we double up. Like in a given period, you do 2 strips a day for a while, so you get yourself a little cushion. But it's not something everybody is suited for. And we'll talk about how Ernie got to that point a little later. Here he is at the age of 19. At the age of 15, he dropped out of school. He lived in the Bronx with his parents. And at that point, in the 1920s, a lot of kids in working class neighborhoods like the Bronx, they never got beyond 8th grade. They weren't expected to. In fact, they were actually expected to go work and bring money into the family. So at the age of 15, Ernie asked if he could quit school and start work. His parents said, "What would you like to do?" He had 2 suggestions. One, to be a busboy on the Cunard shipping line, which happily he never was accepted for. And the other was to be a copy boy for the New York World, downtown New York. That was the paper that he read every day as a kid. His favorite strip was Happy Hooligan. And he was a typical teenage boy at that time, loved comics, had no particular ambition towards doing any, but he just loved comics. And a copy boy was an easy job for people to get. So that's what he did. So this is an early attempt at comics. While he was at the New York World, do you guys know what a copy boy is? Okay, so a copy boy is usually a teenage boy. At any given moment on the multiple floors of a newspaper, somebody will finish writing something, typing something, and they yell "copy boy." So the copy boy will come grab the pieces of paper and take them to an editor. And they were always they always went to a rewrite person. They were then rewritten, then the copy boy took them to the compositor where they were actually put into the newspaper. So when Ernie got that job, he would get assigned very often to go up to the bullpen. And the bullpen in newspapers of those days was where all of the artists and cartoonists worked in one big room. So little teenage Ernie would bring up some copy to the bullpen and suddenly be in the midst of literally 30 cartoonists all working right in front of him. The first thing he said was, or thought was, this is what I want to do. That was when he became goal-oriented like that. There's the New York World. Called Newspaper Row at the time. Broadway, down by Reed Street. All these buildings were, each housed a different newspaper. The New York Times was down there. The New York World was the, had the largest circulation of any paper in the world. So that's where Ernie went because he thought it would be fun. So here he is being a copy boy. Whoops, well, anyway. So after he was working as a copy boy for a while, he started talking to the cartoonists. He would say things like, you know, where do you get your ideas? How can I become a cartoonist? He actually was kind of taken in and mentored by several cartoonists. One in particular who was a completely forgettable cartoonist. His work is really of no interest whatsoever to me. But this guy really took Ernie on as a kind of, almost like a father figure. So Ernie would say, so what kind of pen do you use? What kind of paper do you use? And this guy would tell him all the details. And then Ernie would say, so what should I start with? What kind of what should I put in some black areas into the strip that you're doing? And the guy says, no, the first thing you should start with is erasing. And he handed Ernie an art gum eraser. Ernie then had the job for about a year of erasing the pencil lines of all of the inked cartoonists' work, all of which appeared in the New York World and were syndicated around the country. This would be the ideal school for any cartoonist. All he did was sit at a drawing table, look at the original art of some incredible stuff, and then erase. The pencil lines had to be erased because they would pick up when they were photographed to be printed in the paper. So everybody drew with a number 2 pencil, and you had to erase those lines before it went into the compositor where they made the plates. He also was given the job of making the grid for the crossword puzzle by hand, once a week. The New York World invented the crossword puzzle. That was where it started. As it says at the bottom there, the job did nothing for my sense of perspective, but it gave me a lasting familiarity with the T-square. And here, these are golden moments in my research. Before Ernie started actually doing a daily strip, he realized that his skill was not fully rounded. He could draw funny characters, but he didn't feel his figure drawing was very good. So he decided to take a class at the National Academy of Design in New York on 109th Street in Amsterdam. Who should he sit next to? You guys, are you familiar with Reginald Marsh's work? He sits next to Reginald Marsh in the figure drawing class, and they become friends. They go to burlesque houses, and in the balcony, they sketch the strippers together. There are only 2 drawings that survive from this period. They're beautiful. They're actually watercolors. I reproduced one in the book. But Ernie became friends with my favorite painter. This is, if I had to say who is my very favorite painter of the modern era, it would be Reginald Marsh, who is famous for depicting New York scenes. So my favorite cartoonist and my favorite painter knew each other, had a friendship, and worked together, sketching strippers in the burlesque houses. Like I say, these are golden moments that are handed to you when you're doing a biography. There's one of his drawings. Later, when asked how he felt about Reginald Marsh, he called him that sniveling little bastard. I could not find out why he did that. I desperately tried to find out why they fell out as friends. He called him that sniveling little bastard. Poor Reginald Marsh. Reginald Marsh, by the way, worked in comics. He did 3 single panel daily strips, single panels for the New York Daily News over a period of a couple of years. No one has ever thought to anthologize them or reprint them. They're sketches. They're just impressions, like people on the subway, people on the sidewalk. They don't have punchlines. They're not supposed to be funny, but they're wonderful. Here's the other. One of the other ones left. So Ernie was adding humor, obviously, into his figure drawing. And he did them in watercolor, which is kind of nice. So here's Ernie. And when you see, I'm showing you some photographs. When you see that there are lines around the photograph, that's because when I'm about to draw somebody, I take a photograph and I make a photocopy of it. And then in a pen line, I draw them right on top of the copy, not for final reproduction purposes, just to get a feeling for their face and their clothing. It just gives me it starts me down the right path to make these the images in these photographs be as true to life as I can make. This is a candid shot of Ernie in the kitchen, probably taken by his wife. He does not look happy to be doing the dishes. Ernie smoked over 2 packs a day. I have a feeling it's a good possibility that's what killed him, although he had Parkinson's. You don't usually die of Parkinson's, so I think it was, he smoked Kent's, sometimes 3 packs a day. Too bad. He had at least 10 more years in him, but he liked his Kent's. So this was early in his career when he still hadn't done a daily strip. And he kind of did whatever he felt like doing. And so he would do these longer pieces that were never meant to be in daily newspapers. They were usually in magazines. But in 1925, so he was 19 years old, there's a very popular comic strip the New York World published called Fritzie Ritz. Fritzie Ritz was a kind of a flapper character, an independent woman who had a series of boyfriends who she treated very badly. She had adventures where she went to Hollywood to break into the movies. She had 0 interest in a family or marriage, and it was a very successful comic strip. She also looked, sexually alluring, and that was part of her popularity. She was a pinup girl a little bit. Pinup girls really hadn't become codified until the 40s, but in the 1920s, she was a version of a pinup girl. But not a pinup girl in personality. In personality, she was extremely a strong figure. So in 1925, the cartoonist who was doing Fritzie Ritz, a man named Larry Whittington, whose name does not resonate in comic history much, he quit the strip because he wanted to take a better deal from a different comic syndicate. The people that ran the New York World thought, this is one of our most popular strips, we have to find somebody to take it over. Little did they know, Larry Whittington had been training Ernie for about 6 months to take over. So at the moment when Ernie was ready to take over, he had already practiced enough to be able to draw the characters the way they were. At 19, he was the youngest cartoonist to ever have a syndicated comic strip. And he inherited it. It was not his creation. So that went on for 8 years, and he was getting tired of it. And he and his wife were talking about it. How can they inject some kind of new life into this Fritzie Ritz strip? So Nancy, so Ernie and his wife Abby came up with the idea, why don't we give Fritzie a niece? Someone that just appears all of a sudden. It's her responsibility. And the niece will be a troublemaker. She will inject. Humor is all about trouble, problems, things going wrong. That's what makes people laugh, right? So Nancy was introduced in a very early drawing. You see in the middle there, she actually was sitting on 3 rocks. In the bottom of this page you're looking at, there's an arrow pointing to the moment when Nancy appears. So Fritzie is having a kind of a date with one of her boyfriends, and Nancy interrupts them by saying, "Tell him the one I pulled last night, Fritzie." So she's acting as a wise guy, a wisecrack character. By the way, if you'll notice, Fritzie has sort of normal human anatomy, but her boyfriends all were complete nerds, almost without exception. There was an occasional good-looking guy, but he disappeared quickly. Most of her boyfriends we would call nerds or losers even. This was a formula that Ernie did not invent, nor did Larry Wennington, but it was a tried and true kind of way for cartoon characters to act with each other. So here's anytime a cartoonist does a daily comic strip, like if you look at my very first Zippy strips and you looked at the one I made yesterday, you would detect somewhat of a difference in the anatomy and the costume and just the shape of his head. The more you draw something over and over again, the more it gradually changes. I think it would be true for anybody, not just the daily cartoonist. If you had to draw the same portrait every day for the rest of your life, the beginning and the end of a certain period, they would change. You would see an evolution. So here's Nancy, when he never intended her to be a major character. She does have the distinctive hair, not quite the way we see it later, but it does look kind of like Nancy a little bit. And then you see in the next panel about 1935, she becomes a little cuter. In 1938, suddenly she shrank. That went on for a few years. And in 1943, she grew a few inches taller. And then around 1950, she became the iconic Nancy that we recognize, that we think of as Nancy. So you can see there's a similarity. But the previous Nancy, the early Nancys, to me are, I like them, but the iconic Nancy from the 50s and 60s that we think of as the essential Nancy is that has that perfection quality that Bushmiller was always after, making everything absolutely perfect. When in his last few years, when he was too sick to hold a pen, he had several assistants. When they did a Nancy strip, they had to bring it to him and show it to him. And if they didn't do the exact amount of spikes coming out of Nancy's hair, he would tell them to redo it. He actually had a number. At a certain size, Nancy was to have 69 spikes. At a certain bigger number, 128 spikes. And a certain really small number, 35 spikes. And he would count them. He was a micromanager. His assistants dreaded this relationship because he would always tell them you didn't get it right. And one of them was one of the major cartoonists for Superman, the Superman daily comic strip. He was asked in his career, what was the toughest job you ever had? Was it Superman? He said, no, it was doing the spikes on Nancy's hair. He said he had to take a fountain pen and sand off the bottom of it so it was a square nib. And that was held at a certain angle that made a perfect spike. And he would count them. 1, 2, 3, get them all right. Because if you didn't, Ernie would tell him, do the job over. There's a few things in the Nancy strip that I had to deal with that they can't be ignored. Sluggo is apparently an 8-year-old boy, but in some ways he acts like a man, and his interest in women is ridiculously precocious. To this day, I don't think any 8-year-old boy has. Maybe 10 or 11-year-old boys might begin to have a feeling for a female figure that feels kind of attractive. At 8, I don't think so. But this is what Ernie did because he thought it was funny. And in those days, nobody said, Ernie, you can't do that. You're politically incorrect. You can't make Sluggo feel a sexual urge towards a grown woman. That doesn't fly. So for Ernie, this was just a source of gags. Look at the one on the bottom. I didn't alter any of this stuff. Nancy is looking at a poster for a travel agency to advertise going to the tropics for a vacation. And Sluggo's face appears on an attractive female anatomy. And Nancy is shocked. To me, this is pure surrealism, wonderful surrealism. To Ernie, it was funny. He thought it was funny. Funny is funny, right? You make somebody laugh, you don't question why. That was at the essence of the strip to me. It always delivered on 2 levels, the humor level and the surreal charge level. I remember years ago when I was trying to make a Zippy movie, we were involved with a man named Brandon Tartikoff, who brought Seinfeld to NBC. So Brandon Tartikoff was kind of our guy for a while. He was trying to get the movie made through NBC Productions, which is their film division. So we're just hanging out, and I said, why is Seinfeld so popular, do you think? And they said, well, Bill, because it skews bimodally. I said, okay, I know those 2 words. Can you explain that, please? I said, why is it so popular in Arkansas as well as the Upper West Side? He said, because in Arkansas, they're laughing at the characters. On the Upper West Side, they're laughing with the characters. That's also the formula for, remember All in the Family, Archie Bunker? So Archie Bunker was perceived of as a bigot, and he was cheered on by people who were themselves bigoted. And he was made fun of by people who were liberal, who were tolerant. So you get both audiences going at the same time. This is a little bit what, to me, is the appeal of Nancy. You can just read it for the jokes, and they're very funny, but there's a whole other level going on that you begin to feel as you get into the strip. And that level has nothing to do with punchlines. It has to do with just the intense charge of the surrealism of his depiction of scenes in which he places his characters. In the book, I pretend I'm a docent in a non-existent museum called the Bushmiller Museum of Comic Art in Stamford, Connecticut. I actually in the book, I draw the museum as if it's a real place. And that's where I get to kind of lecture the reader. And I don't know if you're familiar with my character in the Zippy strips, Griffith. The Griffith character is my alter ego, my stand-in. I remember years ago when I started doing Zippy in the early 70s, and it's part of the San Francisco underground comic scene. And I asked Art Spiegelman, who was part of that group. I said, "Hey, Art, what do you think about Zippy?" I brought up, I summoned the courage to ask him, "What do you think of Zippy?" And he said, "Well, I like Zippy, but it's a little bit like being stuck in an elevator with a crazy person. You're looking for the floor that you want to go to, and you're kind of hoping it comes up soon so you can get out of the elevator with the crazy person." When he told me that, I literally, I didn't sleep that night. And the next day I created Griffith. I thought, okay, there's a tradition in humor where you have a straight man and a goofy guy. Abbott and Costello would be an extreme example. So I was Abbott. I mean, I was Zippy was Costello, but there was no Abbott. So Zippy was a little bit too much of a loose cannon. When Griffey entered the strip, then Zippy could bounce off reality because Griffey's character is the opposite. Griffey is kind of analytical and insecure and opinionated, whereas Zippy is just free-form bebop. So thank you, Art Spielman. Without that, I wouldn't have kept up the strip. Another picture of Ernie with my sketching around just to get the feel of it. Ernie gave almost no interviews. I've only found 3 interviews. He avoided interviews, which is too bad. But I'll tell you how I got a lot of other stuff that told me who he was. To me, Ernie Bushmiller is synonymous with New York at the time in which he worked. This is just a beautiful, evocative photograph. In my 3 Rocks book, I do what is called, in movies, I do what's called an establishing shot. So when you move in a story from one location to the next, just like in a movie, you tell the reader where you are. So I loved drawing old New York. I just can't get enough of it. The elevated subways, the light patterns, the clothing, the cars, everything is, I was born in 1944, and my earliest memories of this are actually of this New York. It disappeared pretty quickly after that, but this is the kind of New York I think of as the essence of New York, and it's the New York that Ernie Bushmiller lived in. So throughout the book, I use these establishing shots. You've seen them in movies where on the movie screen, you see a building and you hear 2 people talking, but you don't know where they are. And 10 seconds goes by and you go into the building and you see who the people are that are talking. That's what an establishing shot is in movies, and I do it in comics because I like to orient the reader into a real place. Like in the bottom here, the 3rd Avenue L. If anybody is familiar with my first graphic novel, which was called Invisible Ink, which was a story about my mother's secret love affair with a then famous cartoonist, not famous today, kept secret for 16 years, and revealed to me when my father died, and then when she died, she left me her diaries and journals and a 384-page family saga that was never published. So I couldn't resist inserting my mother's boyfriend into the Bushmiller biography, because that's when he would have been trying to do daily strips. My mother began her relationship with a man named Lawrence Larrier, cartoonist, also a mystery writer. But that was in the late 1950s. This scene is in the mid-1940s. And that was when Lawrence Larrier was desperately trying to have a successful daily comic strip. He actually had 4 published daily comic strips, all of which failed within a year each. He was not a great cartoonist. He was a hack. He made a living being a hack. So there was a hangout where all the cartoonists went for lunch right near all the offices where they worked in Midtown, and it was called the Inkwell. In the Inkwell, wannabe cartoonists would come up to the professional cartoonists and try to find the secret of how to do a successful daily comic strip. So I imagined that Lawrence Larrier, before my mother knew him, was one of those guys. So I even invented his business card. That address on the business card, by the way, is where my mother and he had their affair. That was where they met for their weekly rendezvous. It was what's called, an executive hotel. There's a name for a certain kind of hotel that's literally specializes in a secret place for well-off executive men to have affairs. This hotel was almost entirely devoted to that. Yep. What are you gonna do? 1940. By the way, Georgia O'Keeffe lived in that hotel at the same time. Not connected to what I just said at all. I've looked at dozens and dozens and dozens of Nancy comic books. They were all produced in the 1940s and 50s, and they didn't have original material. The syndicate would rearrange the daily comic strips and cut them up to make them into pages that fit a comic book. The comic book that we know started in the late 1930s. It was a 32-page, 10-cent publication. They sold in the millions and hugely successful. And I've seen many surreal, weird Nancy covers, but this takes the cake. Nancy isn't even on it. The idea of an attractive, sort of powerful female, and not only a nerdy guy, but almost like a man boy. He's not really a man. That, by the way, his name is Phil Fumble, this character. And Phil Fumble, Ernie said, was him. So Ernie drew this without any sense of embarrassment or irony, that he was holding Fritzie's waist as a seagull was about to peck his eyes out while water skiing. It was amazing what happened. These comic books, they produced in the millions for year after year after year. They didn't really have art directors saying, let's make a cover be a certain way because it will appeal more to certain people. Anybody could come up with a crazy idea for a cover and it got printed. So this is the craziest. Here's another one. So the covers are really great to look at, Nancy, because these are pure sight gags. And they're funny, right? And funny and weird. The one on the left, of course, has a gender bending quality, which, if you look at Nancy and Sluggo strips, that was a fairly often repeated theme, to make Nancy and or Sluggo be the opposite sex, because it was funny. But the one on the right, could I ever come up with, I could never come up with it. Nancy and Sluggo are walking toward you, and the first thing you get is that they're bent in a funny way, and then you immediately find out why. And it's funny, but it's also very strange. It's a great way to see the essence, to me, of the Nancy and Sluggo interaction, is to see these covers, because these covers were single image, full of color, carefully thought out to be as funny as possible. Okay, here's an event that I had to deal with because it really happened. And of course, there's sexism at work here. But what happened is in 1950, the ballpoint pen was invented. So the company that invented and sold the original ballpoint pen had a brilliant idea to promote the ballpoint pen. Let's give them to cartoonists and then hire a bunch of female models wearing white bathing suits that the cartoonists will draw their characters on while they're wearing the bathing suit. So this was documented by Life magazine in many photographs and then never used. And I looked into that, and the reason they gave why they never used this event, they said it was too racy, too sexy. But there are things that are given to you when especially when you're doing a graphic biography. And how could I not depict this? I did add something that I thought helped along, to remove it completely from strictly from the point of view of the people that put on this event. So I pretend that I'm listening to two of the women. And one of them is looking to the other one, geez, Wanda, when will this thing be over? Keep your chin up, Margie. It's all for a Spread in Life magazine. I went on for a few more panels in which they said, and the drinks aren't bad either. And they're slightly getting drunk. On the lower left, you're pressing a little too hard, Mr. Andriola. So this is the artistic license that a biographer can take. I put these words into these women's mouth. I have no idea if they said them. But I wanted to balance the scales a little bit here. That's why I did. So by 1950, the strip was in about 450 daily newspapers. So that means Ernie Bushmiller was making about $300 a week when the average weekly income was $50 a week. So he was very well off at that point. By the time he reached the late 1970s, he was making over $10,000 a week for Nancy. Because newspapers paid a certain amount for the daily and a certain other amount for the Sunday. And at first, the cartoonist and the syndicate, the newspapers, they share the income. But as you renegotiate your contract every year, if it's a successful strip, you ask for more. When Charles Schultz died, Peanuts was in over 2,000 papers. He was earning 95% of the take, and his syndicate was earning 5%. They were happy because the merchandising was over $25 million a year. I don't know if you realize, remember Charles Schultz was one of the top richest men in America, top 5. I think he was right below Elvis Presley. So if you have a very successful comic strip, even today, I'm not putting myself in this category, you do financially very, very well. So Nancy was famous enough that he was asked to imitate a great painting for a series in Pageant magazine, which is kind of a, I don't know, it was an adult magazine, but not in any way sexually explicit. It was just kind of a liberal kind of humor magazine. This is his wife as a young woman and as an older woman. They met at a cartoonist party and dated for 8 years before they got married. They had no children. Everything I know about them comes from Ernie's assistant in the last 12 years of his life. Without this guy, who's still alive today, I could not have done this book. This man is named Jim Carlson. He lives to this day still in Stamford, Connecticut. He's an antiques appraiser. But when he was a teenage boy, his father had a landscaping and egg business. So he knocked on, and as a teenager, he knocked on Ernie Bushmiller's door in Connecticut to sell eggs. So Ernie heard him, Jim, speaking with his wife, and it interested him. He said, "Send that boy back here." That was the beginning of a friendship that went on for decades. But when Ernie was really, his health was not so great, then he actually hired the same guy, Jim, as an older man. Jim did everything. Jim shopped for their food. He took care of getting the strips every week to the syndicate in New York. Any business deals, Ernie had a stock portfolio, and Jim managed the stock portfolio. So Jim was in the house every week for 12 years. I could ask him anything, and he would tell me anything. He said when they spoke, they finished each other's sentences. So that's a nice little thing to think about. He said they were. It's almost as if they were one person, the way they related to each other. She was not a housewife because they had no children, but she was, I'm sure, like a lot of cartoonists who wind up it's a long marriage, the spouse, whether it's a male or a female, does wind up contributing to the work. It's inevitable. And it was partly her idea, Abby, to bring Nancy into the strip in 1933. So she was very much involved with what he did. But she was her own person, and I don't know what they spent all their money on. When he died, they had millions of dollars, they left it all to charity. They had no children. They had a niece and a nephew. The niece told me that she thought that Ernie created Nancy because that was the only way he could have a child. He didn't want a real child. He just wanted a cartoon child. Ernie's nephew wouldn't talk to me unless I gave him $1,000. So I never talked to him. That's what, journalists are, that's the first rule of journalism. Do not pay the source. Because how can you trust the source that you pay? They can make everything up. So I never talked to him. And I was very quick to say no thanks. And this niece just gave me that one sentence. That was about all she said. At the height of his fame, he was actually invited to the Eleanor Roosevelt picnic, which was held every year, and it was for journalists and cartoonists. So he's right in the center there. He's kind of mugging for the camera, and hovering above him is Abby, and sitting on the grass below is Eleanor Roosevelt, and the woman in the striped dress is her gay lover. This has all been documented. I read a great book about their relationship. I can't remember her name right now, but she was a journalist. And Ernie and Eleanor and this woman were basically a couple all during Roosevelt's 4 terms. But there's Ernie. In the book, I show that he imitated Roosevelt by putting his cigarette. Roosevelt smoked his cigarettes with a long cigarette holder. So Ernie got a cigarette holder and put a cigarette at the end and imitated Franklin Roosevelt, and people took pictures of him. His politics were not synchronous with Roosevelt. He was sort of an old-fashioned Republican. Not terribly interested in politics, but you believe you pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps, that kind of politics. There's a nice early picture, and then a little bit later, Ernie said that his face resembled a melon, and that if you wanted to draw his face, you had to remember that. He also had red hair, and he was a Brooklyn boy. There's only 2 examples of him recorded speaking. One of them I detail in my book, but I can't give you the URL to go look for the actual recording, which was a promotion for United States savings bonds. So Ernie is at his drawing table and he's looking at the camera and he's saying, Nancy really believes in defending our country. And then it just goes on for a minute or 2, and then it comes an ad. It would run in movie theaters before the main feature. The people that did the book How to Read Nancy, are you guys familiar with that? The people that do that, Mark Newgarden and Paul Garassi, said I could see that, but I could not tell people how to get to it. They use that whenever they give a lecture, and it's a big moment where you actually see Ernie speak. So when you do see him and hear him, he has a slight Bronx accent. In the scene where he's promoting savings bonds, you can sense that he's toning down his Bronx accent. He was interviewed in 1949 for a radio show with Milton Caniff. And in that interview, he has a thick Bronx accent. He's like a cab driver. So I think that was his real accent. He had a Bronx accent, which is not the same as a Brooklyn accent. I can't do either one of them, but they're very distinct. So here he is signing calendars. Those are calendars that he's signing. December 1952. He was very, very reluctant to do any promotion of that. And here he's reading one of the early, not one of the early, one of the later Nancy comic books. This is me again, sketching over the photograph so I get a feeling for it. This was probably in the early 70s. So here's Ernie and Abby when they were young. Abby is quite striking. Ernie is a melon. He's a melon head. Abby has great bone structure. She looks like a movie star on the top photo. She looks very cinematic. So here's his drawing supplies. When Ernie died, Jim Carlson, his assistant, who, by the way, told me not to call him his assistant, but to call him his best friend. She was. He sold a lot of stuff, including Ernie's drawing materials. And here they are. This isn't all of them. There's his two brushes, a magnifying glass, 3 different magnifying glasses, and I think there's more. Yeah. Now you've got all the essential items you need to be a cartoonist. Scissors, pens, with different points, for different purposes, brushes, pencils, it's on the bottom, no, it's a pen knife. So, just a pen knife. I'm sure you use it the same way I use it. Which is when you make a mistake in your inking, a quicker way to get rid of the mistake is to scrape it away instead of white it out. I don't see any whiteout in any of his art supplies, which was kind of surprising. But then I looked at a lot of the art supplies of a lot of cartoonists of his day, and they almost never had whiteout. They scratched away the mistake. Literally, just scraped it away. So that's what Ernie did. That pen on the left is probably one he used a lot. It looks like something out of the 18th century, very old. The thing on the right is just a letter opener. And then all the way to the right are pencils. I questioned some things, just to get up front about it. Was the Phil Fumble character meant to be Ernie's stand-in? So I deal with that at the bottom. And I just came across interesting little tidbits. John Held Jr. was kind of the jazz age cartoonist. Very, very famous and successful. He thought Ernie was the best cartoonist of the era, which doesn't quite go. If you know his work had nothing to do with Nancy and Sluggo. It was all very stylish, all about costumes, caricaturing sort of wealthy white people at play. But what he really liked is Nancy and Sluggo. So in some cases, I actually use the original art where I can find it. So this is an example of a Phil Fumble strip. So you have to remember, Ernie did 6 daily strips every week, Monday to Saturday. And on Sunday, he did a full page Nancy and a full page Phil Fumble, or a full page Fritzy Ritz. They alternated. A huge amount of work, but I think I'll show it later. In his studio, he had 4 drawing tables set up, and he would work on 4 strips at once to get it all done in 4 days. So he'd have 3 days off each week. And this was without assistance. So he was a workhorse. He was a real workhorse. Phil Fumble is a little bit like a grown-up Sluggo, but Sluggo has feistiness, and Phil Fumble was kind of just a loser. He was just a man-child. He was some stunted version of a man. So throughout the book, instead of saying chapter 1 ended and chapter 2 begins, I did transition pages. And all the transition pages are all in with black borders bleeding to the edge of the paper. So you know right away it's a different looking page than the rest of the book. And in these pages, I pasted in all these images of Nancy and Sluggo, and in some cases, some background, but I wrote a transition 1 page. In 1933, no, later, 1935, Ernie got a phone call while he was working, when he was working at the Daily News building in New York. And somebody said, Ernie, Harold Lloyd wants to talk to you. So Harold Lloyd was then very famous as a comedic actor in silent films and sound films. So by the 1930s, they were sound films. You know, it was Chaplin, Keaton, and Harold Lloyd, the 3 big stars of that era. So his first impression when he saw Harold Lloyd wanted to speak to him was, is this a gag? You know, he thought it was being set up. When he got on the phone, Harold Lloyd offered him $250 a week to come out to Hollywood and write gags for him, not screenplays, just bits of business. So there's no record of what he actually did. So I researched the Harold Lloyd movies of that time period, that 1 year. One of them is called Movie Crazy. So Harold Lloyd, even though he's a full-grown adult, he's acting like a kind of a 19-year-old. He lives in a house in the Midwest, and the opening scene, he's on his bicycle, and he's all excited. He's going to go home to his parents and tell them something exciting. So he gets to the home, and as he goes to the back door to open it, he hears a quacking noise. Quack, quack, quack. He looks, there's a hole in the ground. At the bottom of the hole is about 3 inches of water, and a little baby duck, a duckling, is at the bottom. And the duck can't get out because the hole is this deep and the water is that deep. So what does Harold Lloyd do? There's a hose on the edge, on the side of the house. He takes the hose, he turns the water on, he fills the hole with water, and the duckling pops out. That was Ernie Bushmiller's gag. Ernie Bushmiller wrote that. And it was just for a joke. It did not contribute towards the storyline, but that's what he did. And that was common for comedy actors to have gag writers who just did bits of business for them. They didn't write screenplays. So Ernie did that for 1 year. Every week that he was in LA, these are things that Jim Carlson told me. Every week he had lunch with Groucho Marx and other people. Harold Lloyd was had a major social life. He had a huge mansion. He was a multimillionaire. He had parties, and he made friends with all the famous actors of the day. So every week, Harold Lloyd would have a lunch at the Brown Derby restaurant in LA, and he would invite certain people, and they would vary. But Groucho Marx was the most common invitee. So if you remember Groucho Marx, his character in his movies, he's lecherous, right? He's lecherous. In real life, he was 10 times as lecherous. So here's Abby, an attractive young woman, sitting at the table with him and Ernie, and he just relentlessly hit on her to the point where she said to Ernie, "We have to leave. I can't take this anymore. We have to stop. After all, you're working on a daily strip every day and you're doing work for movies. This is reaching a critical point anyway, but I can't stand to be near that man again." When they had lunch, and Abby would fend off his lecherous remarks, and so would Ernie. When the lunch was over, Groucho Marx would follow her to the parking lot. He was literally intending on having an affair with her. He wouldn't give up. Not not a nice way to think of poor Groucho Marx, you know, it's like, anyway, they left, and Abby was very happy. During the time that they were there, though, the most famous, in my opinion, most famous cartoonist living in LA at that time was George Harriman, who did Crazy Cat. So there's a lot of speculation. Did Ernie visit him, and did they have a meeting? Did they talk? Did they have lunch? Given the artistic license that I give myself, I said yes, they met. I looked up online, I found out what Harriman's house looked like in 1930, whatever. And when Ernie and George Harriman get together, what do they talk about? They talk about drawing supplies. Okay, we skipped a page. So what happened in my telling is that Ernie and George Harriman talk shop with each other about drawing supplies. And then George Harriman says, when you do a strip, you have to make your backgrounds believable. It has to be has to feel like a real place. And that's why I do my stuff all in New Mexico and Utah with all the famous outcroppings. Well, you know, if you look at a Crazy Cat strip, you think on one level it looks completely surreal, but it's actually all based on actual landscape images. I've been there. You know, Chimney Rock and all these beautiful, intense kind of desert landscapes. So Ernie would have said, yeah, I do the same thing, but it's in the Bronx. You know? And then I imagine, what if they had done a strip together? Well, I guess it's not here. Well, anyway, I imagine that Ernie and George Harriman actually did a Sunday page together where they mashed up their characters into one full page. And it's called Fritzy and Crazy. And when you look at the book, you'll see what I did. There's another important moment when Ernie was earning enough money to leave the Bronx. And so I have Nancy, you know, sort of transitioning Ernie from the Bronx to Connecticut. Once again, just using real images from the strip, but my writing. And this is me doing my thing where I draw on top of the photograph. This is Ernie's home in Connecticut. It still looks just like this. Of course, it's not occupied by anybody related to Ernie or Abby. And I went on Zillow and I looked inside, and everything inside has changed. But the exterior is exactly the same. On the far right was a building added on by Ernie. That was his studio on the far right. Now it's a garage. But you can actually go down the road where this is, 552 Haviland Road, and it looks the same today as it did then, only from the outside. So Ernie was not a big socializer. All the other cartoonists, the reason he went to Stanford was because that's where every cartoonist was. They were all buying houses there. It was 45 minutes away by train from New York. It had no income tax. Connecticut had no income tax. And housing was cheap. So dozens of cartoonists lived within a 20-mile radius of each other. They all played golf together. Ernie didn't like to play golf. So what did he do? He cut a 12-foot swath in the woods behind his house and smashed golf balls into the void. It's like, it's a Nancy strip. It's what Sluggo would be doing. This is stuff you can't make up, right? This is golden material for, especially if you're drawing a biography, so you can actually show something. There's no visual record of this, but his assistant said you can still see the swath of woods. It's grown over now, but you can still see it in the back of the house. It went back into a forest beyond his property. It went over 100 feet back, and he just smashed balls into it. what a guy. Here he is working on 4 strips at once. This was when he was in full charge of his abilities, way before he got the health issues. And that image in the top there of Nancy spinning around, once again, I did not draw that. That's from the strip. It seemed like the right place to put that image. So what Ernie was very famous for, and it puzzled a lot of people, when people asked him, how do you do a Nancy strip? He said, I work backwards. He thinks of the punchline first, and then he constructs the strip to get to the punchline. So in other words, he has an image that comes into his head that is funny. He sketches it first, and then he thinks to himself, okay, that's the last panel of the strip. How do I explain something as funny and weird as that in the rest of the strip? So in this particular strip, the last panel is a Martian, and you know he's a Martian because the sign is stuck into the ground that says Mars. Ernie is not subtle, and he's looking at the Earth, and a big bubble is being blown. So, and then number 2, so panel number 3, we find out that it's Nancy blowing a gigantic bubble visible all the way to Mars. Then we go further back into panel number 2, and it turns out she's dreaming of the giant bubble. And then we get to stage number 4, and the whole strip makes sense. She's sleeping in her dream. She has bubble gum, which is labeled very clearly bubble gum. She dreams that she's blowing a gigantic bubble that can be seen all the way from Mars. It doesn't make sense. It just makes a joke. It's just funny. It doesn't have to make sense for him. It just has to work as kind of the architecture of the way it's constructed. So here I am again as a docent in the museum that does not exist. And I just wanted to show them examples that are almost purely surreal. Nancy is looking at a man reading the newspaper, but she sees, apparently it's a dog, a man with a dog's head. She runs away, and the reveal is the joke. The reveal is there's a dog behind the guy. And so it's funny both ways. It's funny as a surreal image, and then it's funny as an image that's explained to you. The one at the bottom actually is probably the most surreal he ever did. Nancy is walking along. She's shocked to see something, and we see this is a common thing. We still see them in New York. A guy with what do they call it? They call it a sandwich. Yeah. So a guy walking around the street with a sign hanging around his shoulders, both in the front and the back. So this sign says the Magic Store, Tricks and Novelties, and it gives an address. But this only explains why Nancy jumped up in the air and was shocked. There's no real world explanation. Apparently, Nancy sometimes hallucinates or sees through the 3 dimensions that we live in into a different dimension in which people can be invisible. If it's funny, it's funny. That was Ernie's philosophy. It doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be funny. Okay, so I go way out on a limb. My other favorite painter is Edward Hopper. And I was looking at the Sunday Nancy strips from the 60s. And at the top of the Sunday Nancy strips, there was one long panel that just contained, where you see a big white area, the word Nancy would be printed in there. So it was the title, it was an added on title panel. But if you take out the word Nancy out of all of those one row strips that were featured at the top of Sunday Nancy's in the 1960s, to me, they begin to feel like this kind of space in Edward Hopper painting. They're also removed from the content of the strip. So in the strip at the top, when Nancy looked at Sluggo reading, a strip developed out of that. I'm just showing it to you as a moment in time and a kind of spatial relationship that's going on. And then I compare it to Edward Hopper. And the Edward Hopper I use are all my drawings of Edward. So I don't actually reproduce actual Edward. But I don't know if you guys are familiar with that painting. That's a well-known painting of his on one of his rare trips out of New England. And that's a motel, I think in New Mexico. So at the bottom I say the window, the couch, 2 throw pillows, the radio, the lamp, the bureau, the wall, the floor, Nancy herself, boiled down and served up. I just make the link. Entirely personal link between Nancy and Edward Hopper. I imagine at some point when he was very successful, he was probably getting tired of Fritzie Ritz. He wished he could stop drawing Fritzie Ritz. Fritzie Ritz was an authoritarian figure. She was always disciplining Nancy. In the early strip, she had boyfriends, she had adventures. In the later strip, she has no boyfriends except occasional Phil Fumble. And she's telling Nancy basically, vacuum the floor, make the bed, be a good girl. But she's doing it as a pinup girl. Okay? So I imagine the editor at the syndicate he worked for, United Features Syndicate, might have called him in at some point, knowing that he was getting tired of Fritzie. He would have said, "Sit down, Ernie, I'd like to go over something. Fritzie gives your feature a lot of zip, doesn't she?" Ernie says, "Always has, George." George says, "Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but she brings sex into the picture, isn't that right?" And Ernie's a little bit uncomfortable. "I guess so. What are you hinting at? What are you getting at, George?" George says, "I just want to say, keep it up, Ernie. However you get eyeballs onto the page, that's what counts." And Ernie said, "Okay, but Nancy is still the main draw." "No." And the editor said, "Yes, and that's the beauty part. Cute kids and sex appeal. It's a winning combo." And Ernie said, "Is that all, George? I'm on that part." "I'm glad we had this little talk, Ernie." Ernie disappears and he says, "That'll be all for now." So he wanted Ernie to make sure that he never dropped Fritzie, because Fritzie got the male gaze onto the newspaper. I think it was 1968 when he finally was able to get rid of Fritzie. And I'm going to show you Nancy's reaction to that when we get to that point. So here I have to deal directly with the sexual aspect of Nancy. She came from another comic strip. She was sort of a pinup girl. She was often shown half dressed. She was always in fashion outfits that were of the era that Ernie would draw. She lives in a world when people are normally anatomically created, and Nancy and Sluggo are these characters that come from, just like she comes from another strip, they come from a different strip. So what's going on here? What is going on here is what the manager just said, the editor just said. She injects sex into a strip that wouldn't have it otherwise. So the idea that something, going back to Brandon Tartikoff, that would skew bimodally, so people that liked the Nancy strip because it was funny and had gags, and there were also people, men, who liked looking at it because it was sexy girls from being drawn. I mean, these are images from the strip. So Fritzie is literally displaying her anatomy, and Phil Fumble is being the voyeuristic, moronic guy. And she, look at the strip at the bottom. That's 2 panels of the strip. There's a bunch of strips where she's actually in bondage situations. And in this one, Nancy has tied her up as a way of getting back at being told what to do. So, you know, the levels of sex and cuteness and all these worlds are colliding in this strip. Most people that have written about Nancy never talk about this. They never talk about it. I find when I first began to talk about it with people, it made them uncomfortable. As if we should ignore it, you know. Oh, he just drew Fritzy because he liked to draw pretty girls. No, that's not what he was doing. He was adding a sexual charge into the comic strip with 8-year-old children combined into that charge and managing to make it funny. When you become parodied by Mad Magazine, which was like, you know, that was my favorite publication in the 1950s when I was a kid. You know, you've made it. Nancy was parodied several times. You know, in typical Mad fashion, very direct, you know, not holding back at all, not trying to be just funny, but trying to be just as, you know, Nancy's hairdo is weird. So they're noticing it. They're saying, if you'd like to have a Nancy hairdo, you can find this ad in the paper and you'll have Nancy hairdo just like Nancy. The reaction Ernie had when he was being parodied was the same reaction Liberace had. Remember Liberace? Anybody? Liberace? Liberace was a piano player, very famous entertainer, obviously gay, but completely in the closet. And when people would say, you know, a lot of people just make fun of you. What do you think about that? And he said, I cry all the way to the bank. And Ernie said the same thing when people said, what do you feel about the parodies that are coming out about Nancy? And he said, I cry all the way to the bank. Which is the right attitude to have, right? You don't want to meet that on its actual challenge that's going to. So now I go into the whole idea. Nancy is not cute. A lot of characters are cute. Hello Kitty is terminally cute. Henry is weird but cute. Buster Brown, Dennis the Menace, Little Iodine, Charlie Brown, Little Max, the Yellow Kid, Richie Rich, Dondi, and I'm not sure who that is. The next to Dondi is yes, and Calvin and Hobbes. I'm not sure who I drew in the background there. And the next over is the only one of the few Black characters in comics. And I think it stopped publication. What was it called? What? Boondocks. Boondocks. Yeah, I met him and the guy that did Boondocks once, and he was incredibly hostile. I don't know what. I mean, there was no racial thing going on. He just was. Huh?
Worked for him, sure.
Yeah, I read about that. He had a bad reputation. Yeah, he treated me like I was a fanboy, and I was much more famous than he was. What right did he? So Ernie was doing something that on one level does appear cute, but it isn't really cute. It doesn't follow the cute norms that make things cute. This is where I just play. This is a transition page. I'm just playing with things. So Nancy is calling to me off screen. Griffith, is that you? I say, yes, over here on TV. And she says, I like TV. Are you on an educational channel? And I say, kind of. Can we talk semiotics? And then I say, you know, the study of signs and symbols. And Nancy says, like memes? And I say, kind of, except not about cat videos or fake news, like a hieroglyph. And Nancy says, am I semiotic? And I say, definitely. And reading your scripts makes my brain explode. She says, I'd like to see that. And then my brain explodes. So I just couldn't resist. I couldn't resist that one. There's George Hammond. These are a little bit out of order. Maybe next. Okay, here it is. I'm going to the next one. I don't know how this got out of order. This is the page I described as if George Harriman and Ernie Bushmiller worked on a strip together. So I took an existing Crazy Cat strip in its layout, but I added Fritzie into it and I gave it a kind of a storyline. You know, in the Crazy Cat universe, Crazy Cat is in love with Ignatz the mouse, and he shows his love by throwing a brick at his head. Or the mouse shows his love by throwing a brick at Crazy Cat's head. So I made that, instead of being a brick, I made it be a high heel and you know, whatever. I gave myself permission. I had to ask King Features, who's my syndicate, and they own Crazy Cat. I had to ask them permission for me to do this, and they said, go for it.
Is that a banana moon?
Yeah, George Herman would draw the moon in that funny kind of banana shape fairly often. Just, you know, one of the many, you know, beautiful things that he would draw into the background. So here's Jim Carlson, the man who really made this book come alive for me. Here he is a couple of years ago. I thought he was much older than me. It turns out he's 1 year older than me. I think that's because I don't accept that I'm an old man yet. Here is Jim knocking on the door to sell them eggs, and Ernie hears him speaking, and he says, "Send him back here." Here's been a crucial moment in my questioning of Jim Carlson. I said, in order to understand a person, if you ask, what are their favorite things? Just in general, what are their favorite, what do they like? So I asked Jim Carlson, and I said, what's their favorite TV show? He said, Jackie Gleason, The Honeymooners. I said, what was his favorite radio show? He said, Joe Franklin. Do you guys know who Joe Franklin is? Yeah. He had a radio show for many years. It's kind of a laughing stock of a guy, and he interviewed, he specialized in has-been celebrities. But Ernie liked it. Ernie's the favorite artist of all the artists he could have said, Diego Velázquez. Diego Velázquez painted mostly in the 1500s and mostly court subjects, kings and queens and the families of kings and queens. And to this day, I don't get why that was Ernie's favorite artist. I have no idea. His favorite writer was Thomas Wolfe. That makes a little bit of sense because Ernie believed in, you know, the importance of striving to be successful, and that was kind of a content element of Thomas Wolfe. His favorite music really made me happy was Fats Waller. The guy that does Nancy and Sluggo's favorite music is Fats Waller. He was once close friends with Reginald Marsh, who then he called the sniveling little bastard. These things come and go in researching somebody, and they kind of bring the characters to life. His favorite dinner, his favorite food was a loin lamb chop. His favorite humorist, once again, S.J. Perelman, whose work appeared in the New Yorker mostly, and was a favorite of the intellectual elite of the time. His favorite cigarette, which probably killed him, was Kent. Kent's cigarettes still exist, right? Yeah. So Jim told me this stuff. He said every week I packed up the strips, I put them in a tube, and a guy came from the syndicate from New York. This is all taking place in Stamford, Connecticut. And he picked up the tube, and those strips got printed a few weeks later. I said, so did Ernie get any art back? And he said, very rarely, very rarely. And that was typical. In those days, even into the 70s, original comic art had almost no value as art, as stuff you would buy and frame and put on the wall. If in 1935 you loved a Sunday page of George Herman and you wrote him a letter, he would send you the original art of that page, watercolored. He didn't get too many requests. He was only in 45 newspapers. Ernie was in 900. So when somebody told Herman how much they loved his work, he said, "Okay, it's yours." He gave it to him. Those pages will now go for about $50,000 to $60,000 each. So he hardly got any original art back. What he did get back on the lower right there, you see is a barrel. All of Ernie's originals that were returned to him, which were very few, he put into a barrel as if to say they're not worth it. When Ernie died and all those strips were pulled out to be sold at an auction, they were all curved into the shape of the barrel. So they had to be pressed for weeks to flatten them out because they all had the shape of the barrel. That was Jim Cross's last job. He took care of the estate when Ernie, well, not when Ernie died, when Abby died. She died like 2 years after. Okay, so I said that one of the things that Ernie had, he had a stock portfolio. So Jim said, "I'm going over your stock portfolio," and immediately Ernie, he's on hyper alert. "There's one stock I want to talk about with Jimmy." "Which one?" "Tootsie Roll Industries. Never sell Tootsie Roll, Jimmy, never." I looked that up. To this day, the Tootsie Roll is made by a single manufacturer. It's not owned by a conglomerate. The Tootsie Roll company is on the New York Stock Exchange. I think it's under TOOT, TOOT.
How's it going?
It's doing quite well, especially at Halloween. They make actually most of their money out of the Tootsie Pop. There was a Tootsie Roll stuff in the center of it, otherwise it was hard candy. I don't know if you guys are aware that I was part of the, along with Art Spiegelman and a bunch of other cartoonists, in the early to mid 70s, we were involved with making wacky packages. You know what wacky packages are? These were parodies of real food, mostly food. And they were done in kind of a Mad Magazine sense of humor. So I pulled out my wacky package skills and featured a nice big Tootsie Roll. This was a lot of fun for me to draw. And I did it straight. I didn't try to make fun of it. It's actually with the Tootsie Roll. This is from an ad from the 1950s. It's actually kind of disgusting. I mean, what is a Tootsie Roll, among other things? That's a piece of shit, right? I mean, let's face it. And it's being peeled back and showed to you as something you should eat. So, I just went with it. I obeyed the Tootsie Roll image, and it was fun. So this is towards the end of the book. So Ernie was still drawing the strip, but using assistants in the 1970s. And he was making, an obscene amount of money every week. Not just him, lots of cartoonists like him. What would be the equivalent of $10,000 a week now compared to 1971? I don't know, what would be $100,000 a week? I mean, it gets crazy because the way it worked, like I said, is the syndicate. You worked for a syndicate. They had salespeople. They sold your strip to newspapers. The newspapers paid X amount of dollars per week, and you shared that, or you got a larger percentage of it as your strip became more and more successful. So I don't know what the percentage was, but he was probably making 75% of the take of Nancy during the 1970s. So just multiply 900 papers times, $20, $40 a week. That's where you get that huge figure of $10,000 a week. But he didn't spend it on anything. I can't find anything he spent it on. He just put it in the bank. Aside from Tootsie Roll stock, he just had no hobbies of any kind. And he left a huge amount of his estate to especially to animal rescue. So never came up in my research that he was involved in animal rescue, but that's where he left a lot of his money. So as he got older and weaker from Parkinson's, he couldn't climb the stairs to go to sleep, so he would fall asleep in his easy chair. Once again, this was Jim Carlson filling me in on this detail. So I'm picturing Ernie falling asleep in his easy chair. You know, Nancy and Sluggo are peeking around behind him, and he has a dream. Ernie always said he was after but never found what he called the perfect gag by his standards, a gag that was so perfect that he couldn't ever find it. He couldn't reach that perfection. So I have him falling asleep and dreaming. I'm not going to show you every page, but as he's dreaming, this is a wordless dream. He's being ushered into this world that he created through Nancy's hair. And they meet all the different cartoon characters. They meet Sluggo, they meet Fritzy Ritz. And then in the part of the dream, I envision Ernie just being completely enmeshed and surrounded by all his characters. This is all collaged in. This is all paste up. I didn't draw any of this. What I did draw was Ernie, and I drew the spiraling dashed line. So it's part of his dream. At the end of the dream, Nancy leads him to a billboard in which we find out there's the perfect gag. We don't quite see it though. I thought to show it would be a bring down, would come down, because you might think, no, that wasn't the perfect gag. So it's just a gag that Ernie sees that he considers to be the perfect gag for the purposes of this dream sequence that I did. I wanted to go into his subconscious in this section. Ernie lived and worked in an era when comic art was not in the revered state it's in today, way before graphic novels, way before people like Art Spiegelman or Robert Crumb or hundreds of other people. So he always wondered what he did would it be totally forgotten when he got older or when he died. And I just leave that up as an open question. Because he died before you could ever know that. It's too bad. I wish Ernie had lived a lot longer and he could have seen how his work was appreciated. When Ernie died, they immediately hired a different cartoonist to do it. And that cartoonist did okay, but nothing really like Ernie. Ernie is one of a kind. But when you, daily newspaper cartoonists, not including me, and not including current daily newspaper cartoonists, previously did not own the rights to their work. When you see the copyright symbol in a comic from 1940 or 1920, the copyright is the copyright to the syndicate or the newspaper. The cartoonists did not own that. So when they died, if the strip was popular, the syndicate would just hire somebody else to keep the strip going. Today, there is a new Nancy, done by a woman named Olivia James. Ernie would not be happy with it. I'm not happy with it, but it has an audience. It's in about 400 papers, so it's successful. It treats Nancy and Sluggo as if they're teenagers. And a lot of the gags involve social networking and computers and whatever. The syndicate owns the rights to the characters. They can do whatever they want. If you want to find the very best collection of Nancy strips, you have to go to a book that's still, it's not in print, but it's available. It came out in 1988, and it was put together by Brian Walker, who was the son of Mort Walker, who did Beetle Bailey, the Beetle Bailey comic strip. And Brian truly did put together a book of all the best Nancy strips. A daily strip cartoonist does 365 strips a year. There's no way they're all going to be great. And when you read Nancy in Fantagraphics anthologized a number of years of Nancy, complete. So you go through a complete year reading it. And it will go, you know, peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys. Great strip, not such a great strip. Brian Walker found all the great strips, in my opinion, and put them into this one book. So that's what I always tell people to look at. How to Read Nancy is a very strange book, very wonderful and fun. It analyzes one particular strip from some 60 or 70 pages, but it also contains biographical information in the front of the book that I did not know, including photographs. So I was grateful to Paul and Mark for allowing me to use that stuff. There's another Nancy anthology, Fantagraphic. Dennis Kitchen, the publisher formerly of Underground Comics, has put out a whole bunch of Nancy books, all with themes. So there's a Nancy Eats Food. There's other ones that have similar qualities. In his later years, Ernie's opinion of hippies was pretty much the same as beatniks, hippies, and bums. They were all of the same ilk. He wasn't mean or vicious about any of it. And he didn't investigate very deeply. So he knew that beatniks had a beret and a little Van Dyke beard. And so he gave it to just like to make fun of beatniks. Hippies, he made the world's neatest hippies. They had long hair, the male hippies, and they had bell-bottom pants with wild patterns, but they were drawn in his style, so they were perfectly clean and neat looking, but they were hippies. And a lot of their jokes were about how they weren't clean and neat looking, but they were clearly that way because that's all he could do. He couldn't draw somebody messy or dirty. It was not in his ability. Here they are. Bushmiller's conservative view of popular culture and the generational upheaval sweeping the country often led him to conflate beatniks, rock music, especially the Beatles, the hippie counterculture, and panhandling vagrants into one unwashed, long-haired, antisocial, satirical straw man. So he just had fun with it. I don't get a mean-spirited feel of these strips. Maybe at the time you might, I suppose. If you were a stereotypical hippie, you would object. I think Ernie had an affection for all of his characters, even if he was making fun. He did a lot of Beatles jokes. He did a JFK joke. He did a Khrushchev joke. Here's one of my favorite one-pagers of Nancy. Let's see, what shall I do today? I love to spin on the piano stool. Uh-oh, I feel awful. I need some air. Everything is crazily surrealistic. And somebody says, what's the matter, kiddo? She says, oh, I had a dizzy spell, but I think I'm a little better now. And he says, come into my shop and sit down until you feel okay again. And then every image that she dreamed of is a complete, she was ill with this sickness is they're modern paintings. So Ernie, one of his favorite targets was modern art. He loved to make fun of modern art. To me, it's just perfect. I mean, why not? Why not make fun of? Who better to make fun of modern art? With no spirit of meanness whatsoever, and almost a kind of an appreciation for it, but at the same time making fun of it. You can't top that with anybody else. Ernie was just from the beginning of the book. I was going to put this in the book, but I left it out. I thought it would leave a bad feeling if I included it. You guys know what Tijuana Bibles are? Tijuana Bibles are little tiny comic books, one strip wide, on cheap paper, mostly made in Mexico. And they're complete triple X-rated pornography, but they're all about cartoon characters. So Nancy and Sluggo, I've seen it in a Tijuana Bible. Nancy and Sluggo they have genitals and they're having sex. There's only one paperback. I don't understand quite why it's erotic to have this woman holding Nancy and Sluggo doll. Does she imply she's going to have a three-way with these dolls? I don't know. I never actually got the paperback. I just have the cover. But I thought I would leave the Tijuana Bibles and this out of the book, just to make Ernie happy. I thought it would be a little like a cheap joke. This is the end of the book, so I'm coming to a close. So I got to the end of the book. I got to the end of his life. He died in 1982, and somebody picked up his strip and we saw that page. So I thought, okay, that's the end of the book. And I sat down and read it all the way through. My wife, Diane, she read it all the way through, and we both decided that is not a good ending. You don't want to end with his death. What do you want to end with? So I racked my cartoonist brain, and I came up with an idea. Just as I imagined that there was a Bushmiller Museum of Comic Art in Stamford, Connecticut, I now imagine that behind that museum is a facility in which all of the cartoon characters that you see in all the daily strips, as they got older, this is where they all lived. So I enter it and I pick up I have my cell phone, and Nancy picks up her cartoon phone. And you'll notice the only thing I changed about Nancy as an old woman was I gave her glasses and white hair. She still has the spikes. I fooled with giving her wrinkles, and it looked like I was being mean to her to do that. It looked angry. So I decided to just make her white hair and glasses. So in this epilogue, I imagine that I go up to Nancy's room and interview her. And her reaction is basically kind of cynical. She's heard about this before. You know, she says, "Why do you nuts keep bothering me? I'm retired from the comics business." She's annoyed. She really just wants to watch CNN. And she almost falls asleep as I'm talking to her. And I apologize. And I start asking her about her relationship with the other characters. And I find out, once again, this is artistic license. I find out after the strip stopped, in the sense that Ernie stopped drawing, she and Sluggo moved in together before she wound up in this facility. And they had a kind of a marriage. They weren't married, but they had a close relationship. One day, Sluggo disappeared. She said, "We've been living together on the sly for a few years, when he just didn't come home one day. No note, no explanation, nothing. He did put up a photo of himself on Instagram recently. He's changed." Sluggo has a giant Mr. Natural beard. I realized what I was doing here was I was turning Nancy and Sluggo and the characters in the strip into real people. Sort of. Real people in quotes. And it gave me a nice feeling. This is a good way to end the book. When I asked Nancy, "Do you still have feelings for Sluggo? Do you miss him?" The page on the right. I think about him every day as she contemplates a can of sardines. I dream about him all the time as he throws a snowball at her. Sometimes it feels as if he's here with me. I don't want to talk about it anymore. And Sluggo fades away. And then I say, "What are you doing now?" She says, "I'm writing a Dear Sluggo letter." The next page, I condensed it. In the next page, she's holding hundreds of Sluggo letters. She never mailed any. She writes one every day, but she never mails. Okay, so I set that up. Pardon my voice here. And then I go on to talk about other stuff. I asked her if she collaborated with Bushmiller on the gags, and she said, yeah, of course I did. You know, he could never think about all that stuff himself. I helped him. And then we see an example. I wonder if reducing cream really works. She throws it on the ground and explodes, and the panel in which she's delivering the punchline is reduced. Pure Nancy humor. You've been around since 1933. Do you feel your age? I may be old, but I'm spry. Then she starts spinning around. Don't try this at home, kids. Oops, I'm a little dizzy. You are spry. Have you seen this? This is a obituary that appeared in Mad Magazine. A joke obituary. A lot of people kind of believed it. And there was, somebody came out and claimed to be the model for Nancy. That she said, I lived next door to him all his career. He never admitted it, but he based everything on me. And this woman got a lot of attention for about a year. It's a complete hoax. So Nancy is reacting as Nancy does. She's treating the panels as places to make jokes about how comics are made. But she can't shake this strong feeling she has for Sluggo. And it's been gone for years. She sees his portrait. She says, I miss you, you brat. Then Sluggo's nemesis, his name's Spike in the Nancy comic strip. Spike is just a mean guy who humiliates Sluggo. So I felt no problem about giving him wrinkle lines. So he's very wrinkled. And he enters the picture and reminds her that they have to go to the bingo game. Okay, so I leave at a certain point. And as I'm leaving, a character that appeared off and on in the strip called Dagmar, Ernie Bushmiller would draw children with adult heads. And they were supposed to be beautiful little girls, but they had children's bodies. So Dagmar was one. So I meet her in the lobby, and she admits that she had an affair with Sluggo and an affair with Nancy. And Nancy can be quite possessive, she said. And then she goes on to talk about all the other characters she had affairs with. And I just kind of, I take it in, but I don't want to get into it too much. I leave. And as I leave, I find Sluggo outside. He's just waiting up there. And he says, I heard you saw Nancy. How was she? And I say, in good spirits, feisty. She kicked me out. Did she tell you, about us? She did. I'll be going back. Would you like me to say anything? Sure. Tell the old girl I love her. So he doesn't, I don't do that. He does it. He goes back. And in this sequence, he knocks on her door. I had to make him very tall to account for the white beard. And he admits that he still loves her. And Spike comes in to kind of upset the scene, but it doesn't change that. They go to the bingo game, and Nancy and Sluggo look at each other and they decide, let's ditch this bingo game and all these weird people, and let's go back to our apartment. So she takes Sluggo by the beard, and they walk slowly into her apartment. They walk into her bedroom. They go into her bed, and as soon as they are in bed, they become children again. They become the characters that they were. So I wanted to have it as many ways as I could. And I worked on this last panel. There must be 50 versions of this. some of which show Nancy and Sluggo, under the covers, and that was very wrong. It didn't work. But as soon as they got into bed and said goodnight to each other, they would literally become who they really were, which is kids. And that's the end of the book. And that's the end of my talk. I'll take a few questions if anybody has any.
In terms of Carlson, was he what convinced you to do the book? Or was it, did you search him out and then you found him?
I met him first at a meeting of the Connecticut chapter of the National Cartoon Society, sometime in the early 90s. And when I met him, he was described to me as Ernie's assistant. So I talked to him for 5 minutes and then just put that away because this book was decades from being made. So when I started to make the book, I called Brian Walker, the guy that did that Best of Nancy book. I said, is Jim Carlson still alive? And he said, no, I have his address in front of him. I called him and he gave me 4 long interviews and everything that I needed he gave. But it was after the book was started. I was gonna do it without him. But it would have been a very different book. Yeah.
What generation was Ernie Bushmiller? And he was raised in the Bronx. What were his parents?
Born in 1905, died in 1982.
But his parents, what were
His parents were they were immigrant parents, one Irish, one German. Bushmiller is a German name. His mother, all of his mother had 6 brothers, all of whom were policemen in Ireland. They never came over. Ernie's father, this is where Ernie got his kind of his intellectual bent. His father had ambitions to be something in show business. In those days, it was a form of entertainment. Sometimes it's called chalk talks. So a person will be on a stage and have a big easel, on the easel, an enormous pad of drawing paper. And as they were talking to you, they would draw what they were talking about. A lot of cartoonists did this. That's just a way to make a little money. So Ernie's father was well-read and ambitious towards some sort of career as a humorist, but never got anywhere. He was an insurance salesman. And his mother was a housewife.
So Ernie grew up drawing. Did he draw time he was a kid?
No. He loved comics, but there's no evidence of any childhood drawings that he ever did. He might have. They haven't survived. Somebody else?
His work now is so beloved by cartoonists and thought of in the way that you did this presentation on him. What were cartoonists at of his time, like Kniff? What did people think about him? And maybe also, what was the demographic that was reading Nancy?
It was a wide demographic because, like I said, it appealed to people who thought it was just a kid strip with funny punchlines, but it also had a sexy girl in it. So it had a wide audience. The cartoonists of the day, some of them thought he was one of the best, but not too many of them. I think he was very humble about his own work. He never tried to promote his work. He never tried to make any claim to be a great cartoonist. George Herman sort of did. George Herman knew he was doing something that was closer to poetry than it was to comics. And he catered to a kind of audience like that. Bushmiller said he was doing his strip for the gum chewers. That's what he called them, the gum chewers. He also called himself the Lawrence Welk of cartoonists. So you older people know who Lawrence Welk was. Lawrence Welk had a TV show in the 60s and 70s. the epitome of cornball, right? Just schmaltz. He was a band leader, and he played, ridiculously out-of-date music, all with a polka beat, kind of moronic. Show. When I heard that Ernie compared himself to Lawrence Welk, I said, I'm going to look into that. And I looked into Lawrence Welk's early career. Before Lawrence Welk was the cornball guy on the TV that we saw when we were kids, he was a great band leader in the 20s. He had a jazz combo. He toured through the Midwest. Robert Crumb has his records and thinks they're great. So maybe that's the Lawrence Welk that he was referring to. I don't know. But the audience was everybody that read comics, and there were certain strips that were called continuity strips. So you would follow every day a long storyline. So people would actually remember the previous weeks of how these characters got into this situation and look forward, especially on Sunday, when the storyline would get a big splash. This was before television took over, but movies obviously were happening. But newspapers were, everybody bought the paper every day. And it was always true then, as it even is now. The first thing, aside from the front page, people look in a newspaper, the first thing they look at is the comics and the columnists. The news comes third or fourth. So there was always a very big audience for comics in general, especially in Bushmiller's heyday. And to be in 900 papers, there are now about 1,000 papers in the United States. Not all of them are publishing daily, down from like 2,200 at their high point.
At the time, is there a number that that's reliable of how many papers might have been available to, if you had 100% syndication? What
Over 2,000.
2,000.
I don't have an exact figure, over 2,000. So that makes you into the Charles Schulz category.
Right.
And another strip that was as successful as Peanuts was Blondie. Blondie is still printed, still comes out. Blondie became a domestic strip about Blondie and Dagwood, this married couple with their kids. But it started out, Blondie was the star, and she was a flapper. She was an independent woman who had all kinds of adventures. But, over the years, she got married and she tamed down. That happens. Anybody else? Yeah.
So a couple of years ago, my father-in-law passed away and left me just sort of random pile of things that he wanted me to inherit. And his wife at the time said, like, "Oh, in there is some old Nancy comic strip or whatever." I just assumed it was something from the 80s. And thank you for the great work and the fascinating talk. But I sort of didn't even look at it until recently when I heard about your book and heard about your talk. I opened it up this week, and it's an Ernie. I'm in possession of it.
You're talking about original art?
Yeah.
Wow.
So I mean, like, this isn't, I don't intend on selling it. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not like asking, but like, what would you do if you were me and you just like randomly came into possession? I mean, is there someone I could talk to about appraising it or donating it? Or
Well, I can tell you what it's worth approximately. Between $300 and $500, not a lot of money.
Yeah, that's fine.
When I first was aware of originals for sale, it was at comic book conventions in the early 70s. At that point, there were piles of Nancy strips on a table, and they were $30 each. I don't know why I didn't buy. I bought maybe 5. I should have bought 200. Of course, I probably couldn't afford to buy 200. But comic art had almost no value during Ernie Bushmiller's life. It began to be collectible and framed and put in galleries and museums, mostly after he died. So when he died, the guy Jim Carlson, who was his assistant, did conduct an auction of all the original art that Ernie had at that time. So quite a bit of it got sold. And there's one Ernie Bushmiller Nancy collector who lives in Altadena, California, which is near Pasadena. His name is Tom Gamble, and you may know his name because he was one of the main writers for Seinfeld and Simpsons, and now Curb Your Enthusiasm. So he's like a big deal Hollywood comedy guy, and he has hundreds and hundreds of Nancy originals. He built a wing of his house to house them, and he also has games, toys, all the merchandise. That was another thing I was going to put in the book, and I decided not to. 90% of all the merchandise of Nancy strips I've ever seen are horrible. They don't look like Nancy. Why is it so hard to duplicate such an iconic face with the way the hair is, and everything is so mathematically worked out? But almost every bit of merchandising that I've seen, you just want to throw up looking at it. It's horrible, horrible stuff. And most of it was done after Ernie died. When he was alive, he got involved with the merchandising. So he did the artwork. There was a Nancy sewing kit for little girls. That sewing kit, all of the drawings, the cover, the box, he did all of the artwork for it. But, you know, after he died, they, you know, the syndicate just sold the rights to anybody who wanted to do a doll or a toy. Or there was a 3D pop-up book. I have all this stuff. I did a whole section of the book when I was going to say, you know, it was called Bad Nancy, and it was just going to show all the missteps made in merchandising. Once again, that was a bummer. It was like a downer, not a good mood for the book. So, yeah.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about those epilogue here. The characters, like, are they still paste ups where you've drawn in the extra anatomy, or
everything is paced up?
So with Nancy's hair, did you just subtract? I wondered if you like stuck with his rule of how many bristles to include, or
no, if you count, well, I figured since Nancy's hair when she was old was white, then those technically are not spikes. They're just hairs. In her black helmet hairdo, they come out completely sticking up out of her hair, so out of her head. So I didn't bother with making them exactly 69 hairs. But anything you see where you see the characters, obviously I added the beard to Sluggo. I added the beard. When they're walking in this particular sequence, I used scenes from the Nancy strip where they were in a room with a door. When they pass a TV set, that TV set that's Bushmiller's drawing of a TV set. In the bottom of the left page, where you look out the window and you see the skyline, that's Bushmiller's. That's what Bushmiller's drawing. I just did whatever I had to do to keep it working spatially, but I used, for the figures themselves, with the exception of the beard, I never altered them, or I did alter her hair, but only in the fact that it's white. It's the same shape. And like I said, I decided not to age her face. So, you know, these were rules that I made for myself. Anybody else? Yeah.
I'm curious, what was there like a public opinion, or what was like the catalyst of Nancy overtaking the popularity of Fritzy Ritz?
By the 60s, people were tired of Fritzy Ritz. Newspapers ran contests, and they still do. What's your favorite strip? What's your least favorite strip? Why do you like the strip you like? Why don't you like the strip? These popularity contests went on for decades. Starting in the 60s, people thought Fritzy was a figure from the past. Nancy and Sluggo are kind of from the past. Like I pointed out, Sluggo looks like a little Depression boy. And I wouldn't call Nancy modern in any sense. She's not wearing modern clothing. But Fritzy seemed more dated even than Nancy and Sluggo, and people they wished she was gone. And Ernie wished she was gone too. He didn't like having to do her. It was kind of forced on him. I think he did some very funny things with her. But he would have preferred, I guess he would have preferred if there was a Fritzy Rich strip separate from Nancy and Sluggo, like 2 separate strips. Anybody else? Yeah.
In one of the early in your talk, you showed the evolution of Nancy over the decades. And in the 50s, you said she started to look like yourself. And then in the 60s, you said she was, I saw the caption said, finally geometrically correct.
Right.
What did you mean by that?
Ernie used compasses and French curves. You know what a French curve is? Okay, a French curve is a piece of plastic that's in this convoluted shape that you can pick any section of it and it will be a perfect, a perfect curve. So he actually used a piece of the French curve to get her chin, and he used a compass to draw her hair, or the first attempt at drawing it, and he used a ruler. I teach comics at School of Visual Arts. A lot of times my students say, is it okay if we use a ruler? Well, of course it's okay if you use a ruler. It's even okay if you use a circle guide. You can buy these things, this plastic thing with 50 different sizes of circles. You put your pen in there and you make a perfect circle. Ernie used mechanical drawing supplies.
But he was only started using them in the 60s, is what you're saying.
He started using them much more in the 50s and 60s. Before that, not as much. Yes. And when he had assistants do it wrong, he would say, "Are you using the French curve I gave you?" And they would say, "Gee, I didn't know I had to use that." And he said, "Well, you got Nancy's chin wrong, so you have to do it over again." Sluggo has a kind of a circle head, but not quite. I'm just looking at different. But in Nancy's outfit, the 2 lines of her skirt going out on the side, those are done with a ruler. I don't think her legs are. Sometimes they are. Sometimes the little collar sticking out of her sweater that's done with a ruler. He was always into precision and making things the same from day to day. So but in that process, as I showed, if you keep drawing the same characters every day, eventually they will change. Like if you looked at Zippy from 1971 and Zippy from yesterday, you would say he was weirder then. He looked a little crazier. His head was even more tapered. His polka dots were not quite as full circles, whatever. For years, when I first started drawing Griffith, don't ask me why, but I gave him hair that was, when I was young, I very often had a cowlick. You know what a cowlick is? Piece of your hair that sticks out that you have to like put a lot of water on it to get it down. So I thought I would make my Griffith character, his entire hair would be a cowlick. So it would be just coming straight up out of his head. In 1990, I got tired of it. And so I had Griffith looking at himself in a mirror with a comb, with his crazy hair, and he's saying, "I can't control anything in the world or in my life, but I can control my hair." So we gave him something normal, flat haircut. So cartoon characters, they evolve in a way that you have some power over and not necessarily complete power over. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you all for coming.